Welcome to the Traveler's Cyber Academy, a webinar series on cybersecurity and cyber risk management. Our topic for today, payment card security. Many of the biggest breaches that have been reported to date have involved the loss of payment card information, credit card or debit card account numbers, account holder names, PINs, and expiration dates. This kind of information has traditionally been of value to cyber criminals because it can be used to buy goods and services online, including services like internet hosting that are then used to facilitate more criminal activity. Stolen payment card information can also be used by cyber criminals to create counterfeit credit or debit cards. Banks and businesses lose billions of dollars each year from fraudulent payment card transactions. In today's session of the Traveler's Cyber Academy, we will explain how payment card transactions work and describe two industry standards that are intended to protect cardholder data and to reduce the losses from fraud. The Payment Card Industry's Data Security Standard, or PCI DSS, and the Europay MasterCard Visa, or EMV, standard for chip-based smart cards. We will also hear from Seth Harrington, an attorney who has represented major companies after they experienced significant data breaches. He will describe the possible consequences to a business of failing to comply with those standards and how businesses can and should protect themselves. Every day, Americans conduct millions of financial transactions by swiping their credit cards, debit cards, or prepaid cards at point-of-sale terminals across the country. Approximately $500 billion of payment card transactions are made during the fourth quarter alone, when the holiday shopping season is in full swing. Even with the advent of new payment technologies, payment card transactions remain an inescapable part of daily living. Let's take a closer look at how payment card transactions work, so that we can better understand what businesses are doing in order to make them more secure. As we will see later in the webinar, there are many ways that payment card transactions can be processed, but we will start by describing a very typical scenario. First, a cardholder presents a payment card to a merchant. The card is swiped at a card reader, which reads information from the magnetic stripe on the back of the card, including the cardholder's name, the account number, and the expiration date. This information is sent through the store's point-of-sale system to a corporate server, where the credit card information is stored. Merchants have traditionally stored this information in order to process returns and to provide other services for their customers. The merchant then sends the payment card information to a payment processor, which is responsible for, among other things, forwarding the information to the bank that issued the credit card. The bank that issued the credit card will decide whether to authorize the transaction, looking at information such as the account limit, the size of the transaction, and whether there are indicators of fraud. If the issuing bank approves the transaction, the authorization is sent back to the merchant, which then proceeds with the transaction. In this scenario, the payment card information that is being sent between the store, the payment processor, and the bank can be stolen if any of them are compromised. Indeed, criminals are remarkably good at stealing payment card information. In 2014, more than 30 million consumers in the United States had their credit or debit card information breached. Credit card fraud is an expensive problem for banks, merchants, and consumers. In 2015, payment card fraud losses in the U.S. reached almost $8 billion. To address these problems, the payment card industry has promulgated two standards. The PCI Data Security Standard, or PCI DSS, which addresses the problem of data breaches, and the EMV standard, which addresses the problem of counterfeit payment card fraud. Together, these standards go a long way to providing more security for payment card transactions. Let's take a closer look at these standards, starting with the PCI Data Security Standard. The Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard is issued by the industry's Security Standards Council, led by representatives of major card brands such as Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and Discover. The standard is not a law, like a breach notification statute, but is enforced through contracts between the card brands and the banks, payment providers, and merchants that accept or process cards of that brand. Each card brand also sets requirements for compliance with the standard and consequences for non-compliance. The PCI Data Security Standard applies to all entities that have agreed by contract to comply with it. In effect, all entities involved in payment card processing, as well as entities that store, process, or transmit cardholder data. This includes retailers and other merchants, of course, as well as payment processors and banks, both issuing banks that issue credit cards to customers, and acquiring banks, which are the banks used by merchants to accept payment card transactions. The standard protects the cardholder's name, the account number, or PAN, and the expiration date. It also protects the 3-digit security code, sometimes known as CVV2 or CVC2, that is found on the back of most payment cards. Finally, the standard protects the data stored on the magnetic stripe on the back of most payment cards. The standard includes 6 control objectives, which are associated with 12 security requirements. The first control objective is to build and maintain a secure network and systems, with 2 associated requirements. 1. Install and maintain a firewall to protect cardholder data, and 2. Change default vendor passwords and security configurations. The second objective is to protect cardholder data. The third objective is to maintain a vulnerability management program. The fourth objective is to implement strong access controls. The fifth objective is to monitor and test networks regularly. And the last objective is to maintain an information security policy. For each of the 12 security requirements, the PCI Data Security Standard provides more detailed sub-requirements and guidance, as well as procedures for testing compliance with the standard. For example, if we drill down on one of the 12 requirements, restricting access to cardholder data based on a need to know, the PCI Data Security Standard establishes several sub-requirements. Access to systems and cardholder data should be limited to employees whose jobs require such access based on the employee's job function and classification. Access control technology should be in place that only allow access when access is specifically granted, and written policies and procedures should be used and made known. To assess compliance with this requirement, the PCI Data Security Standard specifies that the written policy on access controls should be examined, that a sampling of job functions and classifications be checked for compliance with the policy, that interviews be conducted of employees and managers, and that access control systems are in place and properly configured. Each card brand, like Visa, MasterCard, or American Express, sets its own requirements for compliance. Visa and MasterCard, for example, have grouped merchants into 4 categories, or levels, based largely on the number of card transactions conducted each year. Merchants that conduct no more than 1 million transactions each year, including no more than 20,000 e-commerce transactions, are Level 4 merchants. Merchants that conduct no more than 1 million transactions with more than 20,000 e-commerce transactions are Level 3 merchants. Merchants that conduct between 1 million and 6 million transactions are Level 2 merchants. And merchants that conduct more than 6 million transactions each year are Level 1 merchants. Visa and MasterCard require that Level 1 merchants establish compliance with the PCI Data Security Standard by submitting a report on compliance, which is most often prepared by an external Qualified Security Assessor, or QSA. Other merchants may establish compliance through self-assessment questionnaires. In addition, there are requirements for network scans performed by approved scan vendors, which must be done on a quarterly basis. The second payment card standard that we will cover today was first developed by Europay, MasterCard, and Visa, and is known as the EMV standard. The EMV standard covers the use of payment cards with integrated circuits, or chips, built into them. The EMV standard also addresses tap-to-pay methods, such as Apple Pay, but we will focus today on the chip card technology. When a customer uses an EMV card, the card is dipped into the reader rather than swiped. The chip is used to authenticate the card, or in other words, to establish that the card is genuine and is not a counterfeit card. The chip on the card contains one or more programs, which can vary depending on card issuer, that can generate a unique cryptographic code for each transaction, a form of digital signature. In other words, instead of passing static information such as the cardholder name and the primary account number, which is what we saw earlier in the traditional payment card transaction, an EMV transaction includes dynamic data that is different for each transaction. Let's see how that works. As before, the customer provides a payment card to the merchant. The EMV standard does not require encryption of the payment card data, which can be stored by the merchant. However, assuming both the card and the payment terminal are EMV compliant, a unique code authenticating the card will be generated. From there, the transaction is essentially the same as before, except the unique code is also passed to the issuing bank, which authorizes the transaction only if the code was generated correctly. Of course, most EMV cards can still be swiped at traditional card readers that are not EMV compliant. In that case, the chip is not involved, and the unique digital code is not generated. So it is possible to use a counterfeit EMV card at a non-EMV terminal. It is much more difficult, however, for criminals to use a counterfeit EMV card at an EMV-compliant terminal. For this reason, banks shifted liability to merchants in October 2015 for fraud losses associated with counterfeit EMV cards with respect to merchants that have not upgraded to EMV-compliant terminals. Banks generally remain responsible for fraud losses associated with the use of counterfeit non-EMV cards. Finally, many merchants, payment providers, and banks are going even further than PCI DSS and EMV standards to protect cardholder data through technologies such as encryption and tokenization. When encryption is used, the payment card data can be encrypted at the payment terminal, so that it's not visible at either the point-of-sale terminal or anywhere else along the merchant's network. At the issuing bank, if the transaction is approved, a token that represents the transaction is generated and sent back to the merchant. The merchant can then store the token for use in processing returns and providing other services, instead of storing the card account number. Even if the token is compromised, it will be of no value to a criminal. As you can see, significant progress is being made in reducing the likelihood and cost of payment card data breaches and counterfeit card fraud through the adoption of new standards and technologies. What happens when a company does not comply with those standards? For an answer to that question, let's hear from attorney Seth Harrington, a data breach expert.
In any data breach, particularly data breaches involving personal information, an entity will face a number of potential exposures. The loss of reputation and goodwill, business interruption. In addition, there are the costs of responding to a data breach, which could require costs of forensic investigation, remediation, recreation of data, and as well as the retention of outside consultants such as public relations firms, outside counsel, and forensic investigators, as well as the cost to notify any individuals whose information may have been impacted by the breach, as well as offering credit monitoring or insurance. In addition to the exposure that any entity that suffers a data breach may face, in the event of a payment card data breach, there's also the risk of fines, fees, and assessments imposed by the card brands. The fines are imposed with respect to the alleged non-compliance with the PCI DSS. The fees are imposed with respect to costs that the card brand allegedly incurs in responding to and investigating a data incident. But the most significant portion are the issuer reimbursement assessments for fraud losses and operating expense losses that issuers allegedly incur in reimbursing cardholders and reissuing cards. In our experience, the fines and fees range from the tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars in exposure, whereas the assessments range from the millions to tens of millions in significant breaches. The assessments are based on the number of cards alleged to have been exposed as a part of a breach. The best thing that an entity can do in order to defend against fines and assessments from the card brands is, before they are even imposed, bring in outside counsel in order to assist in mounting a defense. Counsel, along with the assistance of an outside forensic investigator, can work to ensure that the investigation conducted by the card brands is accurate, both in terms of the facts of the breach as well as the compliance status of the entity with the PCI DSS. In addition, counsel can advise on how to effectively dialogue with the card brands in order to minimize the potential for fines and assessments. Once the fines and assessments are imposed, there are limited options. It is possible to appeal them, but the appeal is determined by the card brand that issued the fine and assessment itself. The only other option, once the assessment has been imposed and appeal options have been exhausted, is to commence litigation, either against the acquirer under the contract with the merchant or against the card brand itself. Up till now, we've been talking about losses associated with a data breach, but merchants face potential losses from fraud every day. Traditionally, counterfeit fraud on cards was the responsibility of the issuer, not the merchant. But in October 2015, the card brands changed the rules with respect to payment cards issued with chips enabled in the card. In the event that one of those cards is counterfeited and accepted at a merchant that does not use EMV chip technology readers, the merchant, not the issuer, will be responsible for any fraud on those cards. Well, there are three things that an entity can do to reduce the potential of experiencing a payment card breach. The first is to have a robust information security program in place, headed by an individual and department specifically tasked with maintaining information security. The second is to conduct appropriate outside assessments of your payment card security. This should include not only penetration testing and vulnerability scans, but also bringing in an outside assessor known as a qualified security assessor in order to validate compliance with PCI DSS, and following up on all of those recommendations from all of those outside assessors. Finally, having an incident response plan in place in order to respond to the potential incident can help reduce potential exposure. Insurance can help mitigate the financial exposure of a data breach, including not only the costs of retaining outside counsel and vendors to respond to a data breach, but also potentially for fines, fees, and assessments that a card brand may impose, as well as the costs of defending litigation and regulatory investigations.
During this session of the Traveler Cyber Academy, we have illustrated payment card transactions in the context of a consumer physically presenting a payment card to a merchant. This is called a card-present transaction. Many forms of card-not-present transactions take place every day. Each of these card-not-present transactions can involve cardholder data that is potentially vulnerable to thieves, and merchants, payment processors, and banks must adhere to the PCI data security standard with respect to the data from these types of transactions as well. All businesses that accept payment card transactions or that process or store payment card information should adopt security-conscious practices and procedures. For example, companies should store payment card information only when there is a legitimate business need to do so. In fact, the PCI data security standard requires companies to keep cardholder data storage to a minimum by implementing appropriate data retention and disposal policies, procedures, and processes. Businesses should also adopt stronger security controls and technology, such as encryption and tokenization, consistent with the needs and resources of the business. It is also important for businesses to test and validate their computer and network security by working with outside experts, such as qualified security assessors. Not only will this help to improve a business's cybersecurity, it can also help to reduce a business's exposure to PCI penalties in the event of a data breach. Finally, businesses should consider obtaining cyber insurance, which can provide coverage or defray the costs of a data breach, including PCI fines, fees, and assessments. Thank you very much for your time today. We hope you enjoyed this session of the Traveler Cyber Academy on payment card security and understand better how important it is for businesses to be prepared. If you have any further questions, please contact us at trvcyber@ems.travelers.com. For a replay of this session, to share with your colleagues, or to find additional resources on this topic, please visit travelers.com/cyberadvantage.